If Nigel can make a big appeal to the sort of late teens and early 20s, that could bring some seismic change down the line.
The real issue is, do you want a Starmer government or don't you? And any sane person of a conservative nature cannot conceivably want a Starmer government.
There seems to be quite a lot of contradiction, I think, between the various top people in the Labour Party on these trans issues.
I don't think a vote for reform is a wasted vote. I think my vote for the Conservatives in 2019 was wasted.
We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. The sun has got his hat on, Allison. We're in the midst of a 4-day heatwave alert. There are, though, showers across parts of northern England, and it seems election gloom is casting a shadow across much of the country. While the Tories are embroiled in a betting scandal, Labour's struggling to fend off anger, expressed not least by J.K. Rowling, that the party's championing of trans rights is imperiling safe spaces for women. Nigel Farage is meanwhile making hay, rallying reform voters in Maidstone, Clacton and beyond. You followed Farage on the campaign trail, Allison, with polls suggesting he will win in Clacton, to be joined perhaps by other Reform MPs, the upstart party, now with a real chance of breaking through the thick glass door of our first-past-the-post voting system to bag a handful of Westminster seats. But what will that mean for those Tories surviving into the next Parliament? Will the presence of Farage influence who they pick as Tory leader? Lots to discuss, Allison. But before we get going, I know Planet Normal listeners, to say nothing of FIFA and the broader international football commentariat, everyone's waiting for your verdict on the Euros. Scotland are brave, they're out, but lauded by their fans. England, meanwhile, are through to the last 16, having topped their group. And yet no one can work out if Trent Alexander-Arnold should play in midfield, not at all, or at left back. What say you, my learned co-pilot?
It's lucky you're not near me. It's lucky you're not in the same postal district, you cheeky sod.
Have you been watching?
I have been watching, yes.
With your menfolk?
Yeah, we were watching with friends last night, and I think several people just sloped off to bed in despair. Why is he bringing Cole Palmer on at the beginning? This is the thing I've been taught to say. Lovely Cole came on for about 30 seconds and appeared to know he had to kick the ball, Halligan. A big improvement on some of the team.
Indeed. It's all about Kobe Mainu. Just keep saying that and you'll sound as if you know what you're talking about.
It looks like they may be playing the Dutch on Sunday, and I did watch the Netherlands match because himself is absolutely wedded to each game, and the Dutch looked as lacklustre as us. So who knows? We could, if it's them, we could even beat them in a thrilling 0-0 draw.
So tell me about Clacton. You were on the road, the campaign trail, with Mr. Farage.
I certainly was, yeah. So didn't quite know what to expect. Turned up at the Reform HQ in Clacton, which was in a seaside-tastic Pier Avenue. Oh, God, Liam, the HQ. I mean, it didn't dare go in the ladies' loos, I tell you, without taking a deep breath. Run in, hold your breath, lightning wee, and then get out as fast as possible. It was not a fragrant place. And I did say to Mr. Farage that not easily confused with Mar-a-Lago, which is the redoubt of his hero, Donald Trump.
This is the romance of frontline politics, Allison.
Oh, well, I mean, do you know what? It was genuinely amazing. It really was. So you had all sorts turning up to deliver leaflets. Nigel came out looking incredibly dapper in that slight sort of Wimbledon umpire way he has, gave a little rallying speech to the troops, and off we went. And we went to nearby Frinton. Now, he's expected to do well in the more Brexity working class Clacton, but Frinton is, I was told, a cut above where peaceful and quiet round here, several people said. And he was just attracting really huge crowds, people following him down the road, people pulling over their cars, winding down their windows, saying, Nigel, Nige, go Nige. The thing that really amused me, Liam, you'll like this, is that I spoke to one very nicely turned out lady, Tory lady, and I said, "Are you voting for Nigel?" And she said, "Yes, but don't tell my husband, he loathes him."
Wow.
And then further down the road, another sort of quite fit blonde lady coming out of a spa, and she said, "I'm voting for Nigel, but don't tell my husband." So I think we may have found, Liam, a new voting bloc, the shy Tory wives for Nigel.
That's exactly what Nigel said to us, actually, when he appeared on the podcast. He said that originally UKIP was about men, but then women gradually came in. And when they did, they came in droves. And Frinton is a cut above. It's in North Essex. It's rather genteel. It's a long way from the Giza Belt. And it's not natural reform territory. It has to be said. This is by no means an impoverished coastal community. It's extremely affluent.
I think he's going to win very easily. That would be my prediction, judging by what we experienced on the day. Unlike Starmer or Sunak, he's, whatever you think of him, Liam, he's out there. He's had 2 physical attacks on him during the election campaign so far. He has got a couple of security guys, but he marches up and down, goes in and out of shops, and has people coming up and engages them in debate. There was only one person who took him to task for his remarks about Russia and the West having basically provoked Russia into attacking Ukraine, which has caused, a very, very contentious point he made there. And I think the one, possibly, we can talk about this a bit more, but possibly denting the reform vote, upset particularly some of our readers and listeners, military people particularly. Looks like the reform vote may have gone down to an average of 13%. Those figures are from Professor Matt Goodwin. But I have to say that on the day, on Saturday, when he must have shaken between 150 and 200 hands, there was nobody else brought it up. But one thing I did want to say to Planet Normal listeners and to you, Liam, what really astonished me was the young people, the kids. Absolutely droves of them. Apparently, Nigel's very active on TikTok since being in the I'm a Celebrity jungle. Lots of the kids were shouting, "Brexit means Brexit" at him. They were coming over, and I spoke to a lovely 18-year-old guy called Sam, who said to me that his grandpa, aged 98, had died last week, and he'd been in the Lancaster bombers during the war. And Sam said he wanted to support Nigel because everything his grandfather had told him about pulling together during the war, the kind of country Britain was, he says, we don't have that anymore. And he also said, I said, "What do you think of Sunak?" He said, "Twat." And then I said, "What do you think of Starmer?" He said, "Twat who will encourage the wokies." And he said, "And all my lot, my friends, my mates, they don't want any more of this wokey trans stuff anymore in schools." And he went up and shook Nigel's hand, along with many other young men particularly. So I think we could be seeing something very interesting starting there. If Nigel can make a big appeal to the sort of late teens and early 20s, that could bring some seismic change down the line.
Very interesting what you say about female voters and indeed young voters. It's not just in the UK this is happening.
No.
You and I were talking earlier this week, weren't we, about ongoing reverberations of the result of those European elections in France, where, of course, Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, you could call them far right, a huge increase in support for that party among 18 to 24-year-olds. Just 14% of 18 to 24-year-olds supported Rassemblement National in 2019. In the European elections we've just had, it was 39%.
Incredible.
Absolutely incredible. Almost a tripling of support among 18 to 24-year-olds.
Are the young now starting to reject the woke? Remember, these kids have come through schools with all this stuff being thrown down their throats. Is there a rebellion brewing? I think there is. I would suggest that particularly young working class kids, and anecdotally, I'm hearing that as well. They've had enough. They think it's ridiculous. But we do have a party, don't we? I mean, that was another, as you said in the intro, Liam, we do have a Labour Party, which one of the weak points, which has been very exposed this week with the amazing J.K. Rowling really going for them again. I mean, that woman is cooking on gas, isn't she? I mean, she's not taking any of it. She wrote an extraordinary piece published in the Times, which basically said, I don't think it's safe to vote for Labour. It's not safe for women to vote. And they're trying to, she is saying basically Labour has lost women's trust. And this could have some electoral impact, Liam. I mean, I think we're already looking at them with, as we said last week, a remarkably low share of the vote for the size of the majority that it appears they're going to get. So we've got that gender identity stuff playing on the Labour side. Meanwhile, back at the useless Conservatives. Now, at the time of recording, Liam, 15 Tory candidates are now being investigated by the Gambling Commission for potential inside betting on the election date. And two Tory candidates, after an absolutely indefensible delay, were basically chucked off or chucked out by the Conservatives. Of course, it's too late to stand them down as Conservatives. But Rishi Sunak, painfully slow as ever, and achieved the worst of all worlds, refusing to disown them immediately, saying he was waiting for the outcome of an inquiry, and then, of course, being forced into a position where he had to disown them under pressure from almost everybody. So another dreadful Sunak misstep. I do like the Labour candidate who placed bets against himself, betting that he would lose in a safe Tory seat. But of course, as Planet Normal listeners now know, being schooled by Velma, there is no such thing as a safe Tory seat. So the Labour candidate could well have won.
I mean, why would you bet against yourself? There's a lot in what you say, co-pilot. I must say, just going back to J.K. Rowling before we move on to the betting scandal, Keir Starmer has yet to apologise to Rosie Duffield, the fabulous Canterbury Labour MP, who has been physically threatened, who's had to stop campaigning because she's spoken out against changing the language around gender politics, particularly the description of women. And J.K. Rowling picked up exactly that in her tweets as well. And Labour have sent out Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, of course, who formerly worked for Stonewall. He seemed to be quite moderate in this area, but he's saying now that he's backtracking. And there seems to be quite a lot of contradiction, I think, between the various top people in the Labour Party on these trans issues, that I don't think Labour's going to square this circle before the election day on the 4th of July.
I think that they are saying most extraordinary things, provocative things now. And this is how confident they must be of victory. Not only that, but giving us an unwanted glimpse into the type of horrors coming down the road. So we've had Bridget Phillipson, she's the Shadow Education Secretary, probably quite soon will be the Secretary of State for Education.
Yeah.
Saying that trans women with a penis will be allowed into female toilets.
Yeah.
Can't think of any woman who wants that. Also saying, Liam, that it's quite likely, she was hedging her bets when she was asked whether Labour would implement the guidance, the last government's guidance for single-sex spaces in schools and teaching that there are only two genders, not allowing pupils to socially transition, which means refusing to refer to them by pronouns and a new name, particularly without the knowledge of parents. And we'll recall that that was a stipulation of the superb Cass review.
Indeed.
Saying that socially transitioning was not a neutral act. But Bridget Phillipson, because this is only guidance, and really, Liam, this is why people like me will not vote for the Conservatives, right? Because they had the opportunity, they sat on the fence with this guidance for months and months. It should have been law. It should have been put into law. So it would have been made it much harder to reverse. But Gillian Keegan, Education Secretary, all the trans allies in the Department of Education, they sat on the fence and they came up with this tepid guidance. And I know that people like Miriam Cates and other concerned people were pushing and pushing. And Liz Truss, indeed, I think Liz Truss was trying to get a special motion, wasn't she, through to make it blanket law. So we've had that. And also with a friend of Planet Normal, someone we both rate very highly, Kemi Badenoch. So listeners will have seen a story with David Tennant, Doctor Who himself, accepting an award at the LGBT Awards. And Tennant said that everyone should be free to live as they choose, as long as they don't hurt anyone, to huge rounds of applause. He then said that Kemi Badenoch, in his dreams, should not exist anymore. Then realised, I think, that he'd probably just said something inciting violence or inciting racial hatred. So there was an oops moment. And then he said, I wish you would just shut up and go away. And this, Liam, is Kemi Badenoch, who has fought bitterly for the rights of women and girls.
I can just imagine some Doctor Who Daleks trundling in, looking for David Tennant, saying, exterminate.
Yeah.
Those motorised dustbins.
But Kemi on Twitter, or X as we call it, I mean, she was absolutely exterminate form. You know what she's like. I will not shut up. I will not be silenced by men who prioritise applause from Stonewall over the safety of women and girls. A rich, lefty, white male celebrity so blinded by ideology he can't see the optics of attacking the only black woman in government by calling publicly for my existence to end. And Kemi went on, the toxicity of the debate comes from the left. It always has. Labour and their celebrity allies have no interest in stopping the conversion therapy of gay children who were told you're not really gay, you're just a different sex. Kids are medicalised and sterilised as foolish celebrities, and stupid Labour MPs cheer this on in their desperation to look cool. Boom. I mean, I wouldn't change a word of that.
She's going to give you a run for your money, Allison, as a newspaper columnist.
Yeah, I mean, she can take over the Allison Pearson column when I'm away. I mean, it was just many good points being made there, but really saying that when the left say, hate speech, how much more hateful can you get than a leading actor basically saying that, a government minister, a democratically elected person who has stuck up for women and girls should not exist anymore?
The most senior black woman in British politics. I mean, just imagine if it was the other way around. Imagine if somebody on the right said that.
And what they always do, Liam, you've got the Bridget Phillipson and, Dawn Butler, Ange, the whole lot of them. They always say, it's a very complicated debate. It's got too toxic. As Kemi says, it's not toxic on our side. It's toxic on their side because they persecute women like Rosie Duffield. They send vile threats to extraordinary women like J.K. Rowling and Kathleen Stock, and women who've been hounded out of university departments and sports changing rooms. And when David Tennant says basically, everyone should be free to live as they choose as long as they don't hurt anyone, it has hurt people. It's hurt young women competing in track and field. It has hurt people. It's just what he means is, as long as it doesn't hurt my side, could not care less if you're a conservative woman. So I think he has absolutely disgraced himself. And J.K. Rowling, Rachel Reeves has stepped forward and volunteered to meet J.K. Rowling to what Rachel said was to address her concerns about Labour's policy on trans rights. And Rowling, who could give Kemi a run for her money, replied, for about the millionth bloody time, this is not about trans rights. This is about the rights of women and girls, and lobby groups attempt to remove them. So it's all kicking off, Halligan.
Alison, time's afoot. So
yeah,
I know you're yet to give me and the world the benefit of your views on Trent Alexander-Arnold. So maybe you can give me your views on this. The subject of your column this week, linked to that in the show notes to this episode, you addressed the question, is a vote for reform a wasted vote?
Yeah, I mean, it's vexing various people, really. So I don't think a vote for reform is a wasted vote. I think my vote for the Conservatives in 2019 was wasted because I, along with millions of other people, believed that they said what they were going to do. And pretty much every Conservative principle I hold has been trashed. I thought we'd give a Velma stat for the week. You want to do this? So this is on immigration, which they promised.
We've had Doctor Who and Scooby-Doo this. Let's see if we can get the clangers or
Let's get the clanger.
Bagpuss in.
Bagpuss. Oh, I love
We will stick it with glue, glue, glue. The mice on the mouse.
the mice. I know. Oliver Postgate, possibly the greatest.
Peter Firmin.
Yeah. Absolutely great. So this is a stat here. This is very interesting. It sprung out at me from the excellent Professor Matt Goodwin, and this is about the immigration. And Matt Goodwin says voters were told a big, fat, barefaced Tory lie. Over the last 5 years, about 2.2 million people from outside Europe arrived in Britain through net migration. And this is the astonishing thing, Liam. Only 15% of those came to work. Of the 2.2 million people, 15%. The rest entered the UK as the relatives of workers, international students, the dependents of the students, or as asylum seekers and refugees. And as Nigel Farage pointed out earlier this week, the 50,000th illegal migrant, overwhelmingly young, undocumented males, crossed the channel. That's the number that's crossed the channel under Rishi Stop the Boats is premiership. So I'm arguing, and I know there's a very strong counter argument, and I know listeners are debating this among themselves. I think that we're being told if you refuse to vote Conservative and vote Reform, you're just giving Labour this supermajority, you're stupid and uneducated. And I just think apparently we're told that it's us, Liam. We are letting down our political parties. We should be jolly grateful to be allowed to vote for them in order that they can betray us again. I would say that the truth is the Conservatives are not going to win next week in a big way. I think from what I saw in Clacton, I think Farage is going to win that seat with ease. I think we're going to see Reform doing very well in my native South Wales, on the East Coast, in Essex, in Hull, parts of the Midlands. I did actually say in the column, Sir Keir Starmer could announce he had fallen in love with a giraffe at London Zoo and the polls would barely blink. So there is this massive disillusion with the Tories. And I would say, co-pilot, I'll wind up in a minute, I would say that this was there. The absolute mutiny amongst Conservative voters was there long before Nigel Farage announced he was running. We saw all those by-elections, didn't we, where the Conservatives lost 10 by-elections in pretty rapid succession. And that was not because the Labour vote shot up. It actually barely increased, but because thousands and thousands of Tories, formerly loyal Tories, simply refused to vote. And I know thousands and thousands of my readers will be voting for Reform or for the excellent SDP, for that matter. We had the terrific Rod Liddle on the Rocket last week. And I think if it sends a message to that arrogant group of One Nation Tories who have shown total disregard for the ordinary people of this country. And I think it's worth sending that message and saying, never again are you going to be allowed to not properly represent the right of centre people of this country.
Rod Liddle is a Captain Pugwash fan and the Clangers.
Didn't think it was possible to love him anymore. But
there you go. We've mentioned a couple more. Joining us in the Planet Normal cockpit this week is Peter Hitchens, author of several books, including The Abolition of Britain, The Rage Against God, and The Cameron Delusion. A journalist for almost half a century, he's reported from more than 50 countries with prolonged stints in Washington and Moscow. A champion of traditional Burkean values, Peter's long used his newspaper commentaries to criticise the Tories for, in his view, abandoning true conservatism. Yet in this election, he isn't backing Tory-busting Reform candidates, fearing above all a Labour government. I started by asking Peter Hitchens if he believed recent opinion polls, suggesting Keir Starmer's party is about to win by a landslide.
I'm awfully sorry, I just don't know. I've become, over the years, very sceptical about opinion polls, partly because it seems to me that an awful lot of people aren't telling anybody what they're planning to do anymore, and also because I do think they get used as a way of persuading people rather than as a way of telling us what's going on.
But you'll acknowledge that Farage coming in has changed everything, increased the scale of the Tory loss. How low could the Tory seat total go? Co-pilot Pearson reckons 80 seats.
I have no idea. I mean, I don't pretend to know. What I say, I do remember very well several things in my own life. The 1970 election, when everybody thought that Labour would romp it, and they lost quite badly to Ted Heath. I remember the 92 election, everybody thought that Kinnock would win it, and he didn't. I remember the 2010 election, everybody was telling me that David Cameron would come in the majority, and I said, no, he won't, because I'd been looking at the raw data of the polls, and he didn't. And I think there's a lot of cross currents going on here. So, for instance, I think one of the things that's being neglected is probably a great deal of shifting by Labour voters to Liberal Democrats for tactical purposes in the south of England, which I think could have an unexpected impact. I simply don't know, and I think it's very unwise to predict. Also, I think people should not allow themselves to be influenced in a weak-minded way into casting their vote on the basis of what they think other people are doing. People should vote according to what they intend to achieve, rather than give up in advance because they've been told that their side has already lost.
Your basic view seems to me, though, reading you over recent weeks, you're telling your huge readership, Peter, that despite the Tories' failings, they should hold their nose and vote Tory.
No, I'm saying people should vote against Labour. Obviously, in many cases, that would involve voting for the Conservative Party. I continue to despise the Conservative Party, but I think a Labour government in the form which is now being presented to us is such a danger that anything is justified in stopping it. I'm very much a voting against person rather than a voting for. I think grown-up people in this country should long ago have broken themselves to the habit of voting for anything. You never get what you vote for. But you can use your vote to prevent things you don't want. And this is one of those occasions when people should be very actively and thoughtfully doing that.
Are you surprised by the return of Nigel Farage?
No, not particularly. This was going to be a good moment for him to do so. He's never yet managed, I think it's seven played and 7 lost, never yet managed to get into the House of Commons. He obviously fancies that, and plainly he's reinvigorated Reform UK by coming back into the centre of the fray. That's hardly surprising. There probably isn't going to be another election for several years. He's not getting any younger. It would be odd, really, if he stood aside.
He's odds on to win Clacton and come into Parliament. Maybe Reform will get a smattering of seats. How do you think having Nigel Farage in Parliament is going to change the dynamic, Peter? And in particular, what's going to happen with the Tory leadership after this election loss?
Good Lord, those are two separate questions, aren't they? The impact of Nigel Farage in Parliament will be zero. Individual members of Parliament have almost no influence over anything if they have no party machine behind them. They barely get a chance to speak, let alone affect legislation. He reminds me a bit in some ways of Ken Livingstone, a man who changed politics enormously, but who was a complete failure at Westminster because he didn't join in with the Westminster machine. It wasn't his place. I would think that his being in Parliament will be quite interesting for the people of Clacton, but not otherwise. There is extraordinarily little that someone can do. Very little actually happens in Parliament. The great televised pseudo-combat of Prime Minister's questions would be one in which he would perhaps have one go in 4 or 5 years. As I say, an individual member of Parliament is probably one of the most powerless persons in the country.
The reason I mentioned the Tory leadership, Peter, is let's just think through what could happen. You've got a much smaller parliamentary party, Conservative Party.
But you're doing it again, aren't you? You're assuming that what we're being told is correct about what's going on, and it may not be. It's futile to speculate because, apart from anything else, there are going to be a lot of decapitation attempts, particularly by the Liberal Democrats. Who is going to survive to be in contest for the leadership of the Conservative Party?
You're a really close watcher of the Conservative Party. Do you think that they're going to... And there's a battle, isn't there, between the two wings of the party for what the party should stand for after this election. Do you think the left is going to win and they're going to move towards the centre, or do you think they're going to follow Reform? And that's why it's important, because if Nigel Farage is in Parliament, and it looks as if he's going to be, then he's going to be there as a kind of Death Star, dragging other Tory defectors towards him.
It's almost totally irrelevant. I wrote off the Conservative Party in 2003 after the putsch against Ian Duncan Smith. It's not that I had any great sympathy with Ian Duncan Smith. He was a terrible leader, but what then happened to the Conservative Party was that it helped along greatly by outside media intervention. It became a pseudo-Blairite party, which is what it's been known since. Not an actively Blairite parrism because it doesn't understand Blairism and wouldn't be able to take any positive steps. So swapping the current government for a Starmer government is a bit like giving up having a masochist partner and taking up with a sadist. The Tory party doesn't really have any get up and go. It doesn't have any purpose in life except existing. And the price for its existing in government since 2010 has been that it accepted the Blairite acquis. Everything the Blairites had done between 1997 and 2010 had to remain, particularly enormous changes in our life, like the breakup of the United Kingdom, the creation of a constitutional outrage of the Supreme Court, and of course the Equality Act, which continues to menace us, and which Labour now says it's going to activate, parts of which had previously remained unactivated. And fascinating small part of their manifesto. So all these things remain untouched, and there's never been the slightest attempt in 14 years by the Conservative Party to repeal these things. On the other hand, the Conservative Party has no real purpose, except, as I say, being in government. So that's why it just sits managing the country in a broadly Blairite fashion, but without doing anything positive. What the Starmer government will do, if we get one, is it will immediately resume the Blairite Revolution, which was suspended in 2010, in a very vigorous fashion. I think Keir Starmer is probably the most ideological and dogmatic political party leader ever to come within sight of being Prime Minister. And I think his party likewise. And I've seen Labour people quietly boasting their manifesto, if you read it carefully, is the most left-wing manifesto that's ever been put before the British public. They just don't realise it because they don't know the code.
What really scares you about Starmer?
Well, it doesn't scare me because I'm not. No, I'm old now. I should probably be dead before Starmer leaves Downing Street. I think he could well be there for 20 years under the circumstances. So he or his government, because this is going to be if the polls are right, which I hope they're not, and I work for them not to be. This could be a repeat of 1997, only with knobs on. What bothers me about him, as I say, is that he is an ideologue and that he believes very much in utopian policies and in reforming the country in ways which I personally profoundly dislike. Constitutional in some ways, economic in others. It's a very interesting revelation. It's great credit to Nick Ferrari, who's the only person who actually got within range of Starmer and asked him a question which I've been itching for someone to ask.
LBC presenter, he did a really good interview,
Yeah, the question is, what do you mean by working people? And what the answer we got was he meant people without savings. These, he believes, are his constituency. Anybody with savings, and of course this includes an awful lot of people who are not particularly well off. All those people who've been provident and looked after themselves and hope to leave something to their children are regarded as targets for Labour's undoubted tax raise. I mean, my own view is that there will be some form of, it won't be called this, there will be some form of wealth tax, which will go surprisingly far down the scale of income, just as the higher rate of income tax now does, affecting an awful lot of people because they will not be able to afford the kind of government they desire without it. I mean, look, we have a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's an admirer of Joan Robinson, the Maoist economist. Her amazing defences of Mao's China and indeed of North Korea stick in the mind once you've read them. And this is the person who Rachel Reeves admires as an economic guru. So who knows where she might fetch up. But the idea that these people are fiscally and politically conservative is so comically ridiculous that it just makes me gasp.
Peter, we're already at a 70-year high in terms of the tax burden, tax as a share of our total GDP. How statist could Labour get? What do you think is the tax tolerance of sort of, Middle England?
Well, they won't have much choice, will they? Unless there was a coherent and how shall I say, almost equally dogmatic opposition, which was proposing a different course. This is what we're going to get. The problem with the Conservatives is that they used to say quite proudly that they were a disposition, not a dogma, and they didn't need dogma. It's a perfectly creditable position to have if your opponents are not dogmatic. But really, since the Roy Jenkins and Tony Crosland began the revolution in Labour in the late 50s and early 60s, Labour has become a very dogmatic party indeed. If you're faced with a dogmatic party such as Labour, which is dogmatic in cultural, moral, as well as fiscal and economic ways, if you don't develop a serious critique and an opposing position to them, then you will become them. That's the problem with the Tories. They've never really understood who or what they were up against. They've never developed a serious critique of it. They haven't offered an alternative or thought of one. And as a result, all they can do when they come into government is manage what Labour have already done. And by doing that for so long, they've pretty much eviscerated themselves, so they stand for nothing. And this is why they're now in such a terrible position. What are they for? Even I, when saying people should vote against Labour, can't bring myself to say vote Conservative, because I can't stand it. Well, I did almost say it. I can't stand that. Look, Liam, I have been arguing that the Tories are useless and should be disposed of for something like 20 years. And the initial response that I had to this, particularly back in 2010 from Conservatives, was hatred, ridicule and contempt. People were absolutely furious with me for even saying it. I lost friends. When I said it, that the alternative to a Tory victory in 2010 was that Gordon Brown stayed in office for maybe a couple of years. Gordon Brown at the time was burnt out and finished and exhausted anyway. That government couldn't have lasted much longer. And also, in many significant ways, particularly on the European single currency, Gordon Brown was to the right of David Cameron. So it wasn't a huge sacrifice to say to people, do not ratify David Cameron's Blairite takeover of the Conservative Party, wreck the Conservative Party, change it for something else. But people weren't interested in that, largely because they weren't, I don't think, interested in this form of conservatism, which I support. And what's happened now is that lots of people have come around to the realization the Tory party is indeed useless, which isn't very hard to discover. They see the alternative as being Nigel Farage, who I don't regard as a conservative. I don't regard Reform UK as a conservative formation. It's much more comparable to Donald Trump, who I also don't regard as a conservative. So I feel no great joy in this prospect. And in any case, in the simple operation of the British electoral system, Reform is very unlikely to score enough seats to be a significant force in the Parliament, which is elected on July the 4th. So the real issue is, do you want a Starmer government or don't you? And any sane person of a conservative nature cannot conceivably want a Starmer government.
How do you think Rishi Sunak will go down in history if the polls are right and he loses big time?
I don't know. I mean, there's an awful lot of history which nobody ever reads, isn't there? Probably in those bits.
And is there anyone on the Labour front bench? Do you see anyone there who seems potentially capable of effective action?
Effective action? I've no doubt they can do effective action, yes. But it'll be the wrong sort of action, so you can't expect me to be keen about that.
So let's come on to this document that you've been writing about, Peter, A New Britain, Renewing Our Democracy and Rebuilding Our Economy. It was launched by Keir Starmer and Gordon Brown back in December 2022. Tell us why you're concerned about the proposals in it.
For anybody who wants to research this a bit more, there's a brilliant article on Toby Young's, I think it's a Free Speech Union bit of his website, who writes under the pseudonym of J. Sorrell. He has written a tremendous analysis of this document, which I recommend to anybody. But the fundamental thing about it is this. What the document will do if it's implemented is that it will complete the Blair Revolution. And a large part of the Blair Revolution went unnoticed by British Conservatives for some reason. And it was the creation, first of all, of the Supreme Court, which is a nonsense in British constitutional terms. We can't have a Supreme Court because Parliament is supreme. But it's beginning to act as if it is supreme and taking powers away from Parliament and restricting the activities of Parliament. There will also be shifts of power away from Westminster to large local government centres and to the devolved nations, which will become pretty much solid. And there will be a creation of a new chamber instead of the House of Lords, which will be a
chamber of the nations and regions.
Yeah, something a bit like the German Bundesrat, I think. But again, one which will be totally dominated by people of a left-wing nature.
And it's a bit of a lawyer's takeover. Labour's Supreme Court will have power to intervene in the running of the economy, right?
In everything, because there will be social rights enshrined as well as human rights. And you see how much human rights have been used to frustrate the will of Parliament and the popular will of the country over and over again. Social rights will make this even wider. The whole direction of it is that it removes power from Parliament and it puts it in the hands of bureaucrats and of lawyers, and it makes increasingly the Supreme Court the final arbiter of what can and cannot be done, which of course means that if you ever did get a Conservative government returned to office in the future, it would be caught in this immense sticky cobweb of of laws and constitutional rules in this new chamber, which would make it very, very difficult for a sovereign parliament to act as a sovereign parliament, to actually repeal things which it wanted to repeal. This has been a Labour obsession in some ways since John Strachey started arguing about it in the 1930s. The idea that Labour's changes could in some way be entrenched so that an incoming Conservative government couldn't reverse them was a great preoccupation. When Nye Bevan made an extraordinarily dangerous speech in 1945, which under other circumstances might have lost Labour the election, basically saying we need to be in power for many years to implement our programme and to make it permanent. This is what they've long desired. It was part of the whole design of the New Labour project back in 1997, that they would be in power for so long in peacetime and with such a big majority and would make such profound changes that what they did could not be reversed. And one of their objectives was to browbeat and club the Conservative Party into compliance with this so that it wouldn't reverse it. And that, of course, is what they did. The Conservative Party was allowed back into office on the understanding, as far as anyone could see, that it would not reverse Labour's programme, and it hasn't.
Judges could delve much deeper into the realms of democratic decision-making, fiscal policy, because of the social rights to health, education, housing.
Anything, basically. Yeah. And also the ultimate protection of the Constitution, which currently lies in the House of Lords, which stands in the way, for instance, of the House of Commons saying, well, we're not going to have any more elections. All that gets very confused once you've abolished the House of Lords.
It's the blob taking over policy making in total.
It's a lawyer's dream. And remember that New Labour was people such as Derry Irvine and Blair himself were very, very much at the heart of the New Labour project, which came out of the Society of Labour Lawyers in many cases. And the law has been one of the ways in which they have done this. And now note that the leader of the Labour Party now is another lawyer, Keir Starmer, KC. And here we have, again, a legal approach, and rather than a parliamentary approach to reforming the country, and which would be incredibly hard to reverse.
Peter Hitchens, we're big fans of your writing here on Planet Normal. Great to have you on the rocket of right thinking. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You do know, co-pilot, that Peter Hitchens and I have been having a bit of a ding-dong on social media. Peter is, in his marvellously intelligent way, is despairing of my idiocy at not voting Conservative, because even though he, as we've just heard, despises the Conservatives with every fibre of their being, he truly fears a very ideological left-wing Labour government. And I thought he made a very strong case about that while talking to you. And I think there's many points to pick up on, but I think he's absolutely right that I personally am not as worried about the Labour fiscal implications. I think they are going to come for our back gardens and our capital gains tax and so on. I think most of us can suck that up. But for me, it's the cultural, moral implications that Peter was so eloquently outlining. I'm a huge Peter Hitchens fan, I should say. And he's quite right, isn't he, Liam, to say that the Tories have not developed a critique of this very strong Labour ideology. And then he asked the question, they stand for nothing. What are they for?
An affectionate observation, Allison, is that you and Peter Hitchens are two of the fiercest columnists in this country. You both hold your views with real strength and passion. And yet your interactions in Twitter, they're always pretty good-natured. It's good to see the two of you tussling antlers. And he is such a thoughtful man. He's always worth listening to. He writes brilliantly. Of course, he's often and inevitably compared with his late brother, Christopher Hitchens, but they are different, but they're both really good at what they do. And it's great to have Peter Hitchens on the rocket. I really applaud what's become a bit of a hobby horse of his, rightly so, which is Labour's plans to increase the scope of the judiciary, if you like, in terms of influencing policy. And I note that The Spectator's also had a cover story on that this week, written by the excellent Ross Clark. This is a very interesting set of ideas, and it seems really nebulous, and it's barely featured in this election campaign at all. But if the judiciary does become more powerful, and Labour tries to change the franchise by moving to votes at 16, that really is going to fundamentally change the potency of our democracy.
Well, we've already seen during the Sunak term and before, because Miriam Cates got in touch with me when I was expressing my sort of exasperation on Twitter about the fact that the Conservatives hadn't put the school, gender ideas into law, not guidance. And Miriam said she absolutely wanted it to be law, but they were up against the Equalities Act, which there's already a sort of cage around Tories. We think that they were running the government, but lots of what they wanted to do was government lawyers. She said to them, "Oh, I wouldn't touch that. Don't go there." So I agree, and I agree with you. And I think with Peter, what's going to happen when they bring in another raft of laws, and something I've been very, very worried about, is a blasphemy law, that they will also free speech, that they will make it much harder for people like Z and me and our lovely listeners to even express reservations or dislike for some of the sort of David Tennant type of views. And I think we're going to have to think very carefully. Those on our side of the argument are going to have to think very long and hard about how we fight this, and how, because if they're going to criminalize us for expressing concern, then that's obviously going to be very worrying. But we'll still be laughing, won't we? On the way to the jail, full of all those charming ladies with their penises. There's been nothing to worry about at all, Halligan. We'll be fine.
Laughing with our eyes because we'll be bound and gagged.
Laughing with our eyes. I like that, laughing with our eyes.
But look, we've been discussing the Tory betting scandal. We don't have any betting scandals at Planet Normal, do we? Because our bets are out in the open. And of course, at our 200th episode anniversary recording, you and I publicly bet, I can't remember what we bet for the amount, but we said, didn't we? I said that the Tories would be nearer 150 seats, down, of course, from around 350 when Parliament was dissolved. I said they'd be near 150 seats, and you said they'd be near 100 seats. It looks as if the smart money is with you. A few weeks ago, you coined your 80-80 vision, how the Tories are going from an 80-seat majority to just 80 seats. Again, along with FIFA and the football commentary, Allison, the world is waiting for your latest number. What's your central estimate now of the number of Tory seats?
I think it's lower. But as Peter Hitchens has just lectured us, we should not be indulging in idle speculation.
Yeah.
I really think it's very hard to call, because I think Peter's right and the polls don't pick up everything. I think that, they're up to 3 million undecided Conservative voters. If they swing right to reform, then we will see a remarkable earthquake on July the 4th.
There could be a lot of Tory voters who stay away and a lot of Reform voters who come out for the first time.
Yes.
So it's kind of whiplash effect. Reform benefit twice.
So on my column today about is reform a wasted vote, over 5,000 comments, a huge number of those, Liam, saying I'm a lifelong Conservative and I posted off my reform vote. Quite incredible. So many of those. Now, it's not a sort of statistical sample. It's just Telegraph readers. But there are a large number of those amongst the 5,000. So if you multiply that, if it is true, it isn't always true, although my Telegraph focus group has always been pretty bang on. So we'll see. I think in the privacy of the polling booth, how many will say, oh, come on, let's give reform a go? That could be a thing. And I also think my shy Tory wives theory could hold good.
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We love to read your thoughts. The citizens of Planet Normal.
Unsurprisingly, co-pilot this week, a lot of cogitation back and forth from people weighing up the dilemmas of who to vote for that we've been talking about on the podcast. Bella describes herself as a super fan of Planet Normal.
Are there any other types of Planet Normal fans?
think we've got a couple of tepid fans, but no, mainly they're super fans. Dear Alison and Liam, says Bella, I absolutely adore Planet Normal. I listen every week. You make me laugh out loud and sometimes I even cry.
Aww.
That's at Halligan's jokes. I spend most of the hour nodding in agreement with everything you both say, but recently, on just one issue, I do not. Whilst I accept the Conservative Party will be in opposition, I don't think a Labour supermajority is a good idea. If Labour had been in charge over COVID, do you really think we wouldn't have locked down harder, faster, longer? Do you really think there would be less debt as a consequence, lower taxes? Don't you think we would still be in the EU? You think things are bad now? They would have been much worse. As for Labour's manifesto, let me spell out the reality, says Bella. We can be sure to have an expansion of the OBR and other undemocratic left-leaning quangos. We can be sure to have massive constitutional change, which in any other democracy would require a referendum. We will have a government that awards contracts on ethnicity and gender. We'll have a government which wants to make it illegal for mothers and fathers to discuss their concerns with their children about decisions to cut off their genitalia. We'll have a government who are relaxed about mass immigration, who think it's racist not to give immigrants access to benefits upon entry. We'll have a leader who sat on Corbyn's front bench because he believed Corbyn wouldn't win, but would have been a better prime minister than Boris Johnson, a man who chose left-wing policies, this is Starmer of course, to become leader of Labour, but chooses centrist ones now to become our prime minister. So we'll have a leader who sometimes thinks women have penises, a leader who fought to renege on a democratic mandate to leave the EU. Who is he? And what happens, says Bella, should that supermajority decide to get rid of Starmer? Who would we get next? And if your Planet Normal listeners really can't decide on the 4th of July, I suggest they take a driving holiday to Labour's Wales. Very best wishes, Bella.
Strong words there from Bella. This is from Lynn. I've already voted. I started with a vast amount of anger at the ineptitude of the government and the squandered majority they had, the promises unfulfilled and their inability to gain control of immigration. I looked at tactical voting to keep Labour out. As this is a deeply Conservative area, they may win as the vote's now being heavily split between Conservatives and Reform. There's no way of knowing which way it will go, so that won't work. So I decided to go with my instinct and I voted Reform. For the first time in 40 years, I couldn't vote Conservative. I know all the arguments. I've gone over them for weeks, but still I feel the time was right. We can only do what we think, and provided it's not taken lightly, then there are no regrets. And this is from Sue. The Conservatives, writes Sue, Conservatives in quotes, the Conservatives round here seem to be a bit gutted that after they're having ignored their grassroots support and spitting on Conservative values for 14 years, leaving them effectively disenfranchised, that they're now hemorrhaging support to a party that actually does represent those values. They brought their own downfall on themselves and a Labour government on us. And Carol, I can't quite believe that I'm voting Reform after so many years of supporting and being an active Conservative member. Over the last 5 years or so, I've watched in bemusement and increasing anger as the party morphed into something which is certainly not Conservative. Having made my decision feels quite liberating, says Carol. Strong words, Allison.
Yeah, and in the interest of balance, we've got Ellen, and Ellen agrees with Peter Hitchens. Tell me, Ellen says, how would Allison vote if the election was actually a close call? Would she still give her vote to a party that has no hope of making a dent in Westminster, or would she stick to the least worst option? As normally a Conservative voter, I presume Allison would stick with them in such circumstances. Logically, there's no difference in this election. If you don't like Labour, don't give them your vote by default. We all know that recent Tory governments have been shambolic, but they've faced unusually turbulent, in many ways unprecedented times, and been hemmed in by the pernicious dictatorship of woke media, the aggressiveness of activists coming at them from all directions. I can accept the economic fallout from a Labour government, says Ellen, although I understand many can't. Economic policies can be reversed, but a Starmer administration will bring about irrevocable and highly destructive social changes, self-ID, votes for kids, net zero, more DEI, uncontrolled immigration, and return us in all but name to the EU. We can't stop this from happening, but we do not have to collude.
This is from Derek. Sir Anthony Brenton, of course, is the former British ambassador to Moscow, contradicted Bill Browder on Times Radio by recounting his contemporaneous accounts of the Bucharest NATO event when the proposal for Ukraine's inclusion as a member caused horror and outright hostility from Russia. He was unequivocally supported the analysis by Nigel Farage that Putin was provoked. This drives a coach and horses through the simplistic and electioneering point scoring. Sir Anthony demonstrated an astute and well-informed grasp of reality. The Iraq War destabilised the Middle East by removing the strategic buffer to Shia Iran, its mad mullahs, and zealot acolytes Hezbollah and Hamas. It also triggered the mass exodus of refugees and others through Europe's porous borders. Blair disdained the transition period used by the states when in 2004, 10 new members joined the EU. The heir to Blair, Cameron's Libyan regime, opened the floodgates from Africa. When Putin witnessed America's abandonment of Afghanistan and Iraq, the perceived weakness and an opportunity to flex his muscles. Putin grew up in the USSR and felt diminished by the movement of former satellites to Western institutions. Khrushchev and Brezhnev had their birthplace in Ukraine. Kiev was the first capital of the Russian state. Arguably, Putin saw Ukraine as a red line. His invasion has backfired. Conscription and emptying the prisons has caused 500,000 frontline gun fodder. Top-drawer professional journalism requires St. Anthony's intervention to be taken seriously. His evidence, says Derek, is journalistic gold dust.
I think Derek makes a very good point there, Liam. I mean, we've had Sir Anthony Brenton on the rocket. You know a lot more about this than I do, but certainly what Nigel Farage said, which was that actions by NATO and the West had provoked Putin, that's a perfectly respectable point of view, is it not?
Yeah, many people feel that, not just Sir Anthony Brenton, but George Kennan, who was the architect of America's post-war foreign policy, one of the most distinguished diplomats in US history. He said in the mid and late 90s, he said that to expand NATO up to Russia's border, meaning Ukraine, would be, quotes, a fateful error. So there are people who feel this. It's a much more nuanced situation if you ask professional Russia watchers across the board than you'd think just following the news. But look, I still think it was a bit of a strategic blunder by Nigel Farage to bring this up now. There was no need to do it. Yeah, he does actually know quite a lot about the situation in Ukraine. He's been following it for many, many years. I know, having talked to him about it over many, many years. But I don't really see the electoral upside of, being provocative about this point when talking to Nick Robinson in a BBC television interview.
I agree. I think it was a hostage to fortune, and Nigel's normally pretty nimble at toe tapping around those. One last one. I think we've got time for one last one from Philip. Philip says, I'm endlessly being told now that a vote for reform UK is a wasted vote, but it's no different from endlessly being told back at the 2016 EU referendum, you don't understand what you're voting for if you vote leave. People understand all too well. I do think there's a Brexity feel about this, Liam. I think there's a bit of a kind of movement going on now. I think there's a sense that the quiet people are waking up.
And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week, it's my turn, and I choose Lynn. Lynn, send us an email to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk and put in the subject heading mug winner. Give us your postal address and we'll send you a Planet Normal mug.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, jolly well hope you do, please leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, which the co-pilot and I, in the dark reaches, the sad, long, dark reaches of the night, read to cheer ourselves up.
We wake up to check them hourly, don't we?
We do.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal, the madness of planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers, Isabel Bajard Casso and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.